want to welcome you all to the Brown University Library, and my name is Joe Meisel, and I'm the University Librarian. And as part of welcoming you to this space, which plays a central role in our campus, I want to begin with the university's acknowledgement of the land on which we currently stand. Brown University is located in Providence, Rhode Island, on lands that are within the ancestral homelands of the Narragansett Indian tribe. We acknowledge that beginning with colonization and continuing for centuries, the Narragansett Indian tribe have been dispossessed of most of their ancestral lands. In Rhode Island, by the actions of institutions and individuals. We acknowledge our responsibility to understand and respond to those actions. The Narragansett Indian tribe, whose ancestors stewarded these lands with great care, continues as a sovereign nation today. We commit to working together to honor our past and build our future with truth. So reflecting on this, I'd like to say that honoring the past in all its complexity and meeting the challenges of the future with truth is the work that academic libraries like this aspire to. I think it's certainly the case with this symposium. After welcoming you, my main job is to turn things over to my excellent colleague and friend, Zhuqing Li, visiting Associate Professor of East Asian Studies, and also, very importantly, Faculty Curator for East Asian Studies here at the library. But let me just offer a few little institutional scene-setting remarks before we settle into the real substance of these proceedings. The library was incredibly fortunate when Professor Li, a noted scholar of Chinese linguistics, agreed to devote part of her time and attention to the library in the special new appointment of faculty curator. Her job in this role is to explore our collections, find things that spark her scholarly imagination, and think about how we can make them more visible to the world. In particular, the prospect of calling more attention to Brown's East Asian materials, which are remarkable, was very welcome. We're all gathered thanks to the first fruits of her work here, and they are abundant. The extraordinary digital scholarship project, Depicting Glory, Rare Objects from the Late Qing to the Republic of China, spotlights several rare items from our collection to consider crucial dimensions of Greater China's rich and complex modern history. Projects of this kind cannot come into being without the collaborative work of many hands, and we will hear from the outstanding array of scholars, students, and library experts who contributed. I'm also very grateful to everyone for participating in this great event today, and also especially to members of the Brown faculty who will be contributing their insights as well. I should also note that while Depicting Glory and this symposium were taking shape, Zhuqing was also completing her recently published book, Daughters of the Flower Fragrant Garden, Two Sisters Separated by China's Cold War. I mention this because, as with Depicting Glory, this remarkable, resonant, and captivating family history sheds light on sweeping changes of global importance through deep consideration of particular stories. So, with that, let me turn the proceedings over to Professor Li so that we can begin today's shared exploration of Depicting Glory. Thank you very much.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Depicting Glory Symposium. It's hard to believe that it's actually happening and in person. We had to postpone this symposium twice in the past 2.5 years. And so today's gathering really is a triumph in itself. So I'm so appreciative of everyone coming here today, and especially out-of-town guests when air traffic today can be so unpredictable. Depicting Glory is a digital project that introduces a series of rare objects from Brown's special collections. They include maps, album and prints of battlefield paintings, large scrolls of detailed images of historical coins, and a musical score. These are all products of China's late Qing dynasty and the Republic of China in Taiwan. These seemingly unrelated objects produced in different times and places tell an important story about the intersection of power, status, and collective identity. They have brought together a group of preeminent Qing scholars who specialize in a wide range of fields. These scholars, most of whom are here today, studied these rare objects and wrote research papers inspired by these rare objects. Their article helps us understand what these objects are and why they're important to us and important to their fields of study. And this is what makes Depicting Glory unique and uniquely valuable, because the original scholarship couches these rare objects in history and in the current scholarship. Like any research project, it started with some questions with no easy or apparent answer. It was 2018 when I first came here in a corner of what we call the cage upstairs on the 3rd floor in the Rockefeller Library. I stumbled onto an open-top cardboard box serving as a stand for a cluster of scrolls that seemed untouched for a long while. I picked one up, dusted off a bit, and unrolled it. The moment I saw the map, I knew that I was in for some serious education. The title of the map was 蒋总统的建国伟业, which means President Jiang's great achievements in building the nation. And the nation on this map, I could see, encompassed both the mainland and Taiwan. And the narrative boxes on the map included one event took place in 1952, which is 3 years after China split into PRC on the mainland and ROC in Taiwan. The event described in this box was about President Jiang's inspection of Jinmen, the island of Jinmen, the nationalist farthest outpost against the mainland. And now, I am from the mainland and was fully aware of my own deficiencies of education through college there, especially on this topic. Still, questions abound. When and who had produced this map and the narratives, and for what purpose? From that first object, I went on to find many more treasures, untouched or little used over decades, yet each posed just as many questions. So with the help of my colleague Toshiyuki Minami here, who helped me determine the rarity of the objects, I selected a group of them to show to our chief librarian, Joe Meisel, and petition that they be digitized and be shared with the world. A historian himself, Joe gave his full support on all fronts. And the initial selection of these rare items became the objects of study in Depicting Glory. We know that research libraries such as Brown's is not about simply displaying the images of rare objects. It's about being involved actively in the research, engaging in data and utilizing objects in its collections to understand the human experience over time and place. To that end, it's incumbent on us to establish a solid understanding of these rare or less known objects, searching for answers for questions such as what do we know about them? How do these objects fit into our understanding of the particular eras and the world in which they were produced? Today, we have the experts here who will show us how they approach these questions and how to find answers to such questions. This will be a feast of new knowledge, insights, and discoveries. Brown's own students also played an important role in creating the final digital project. Brown's undergraduate student at the time, Ding Zhiping, contributed original articles from a student's perspective. And Brown's computer science students, Miranda Moore and Jacob Yu, built a digital framework with unique interactive features to effectively present the rich content. And this was done with the guidance provided by Rockefeller Library's digital scholarship staff. And therefore, Depicting Glory is a culmination of many people's work over the years. This symposium is thus a celebration of the concerted effort in charting a new path in collaborative digital scholarship. The project in this symposium have been made possible by the major financial support from Brown University's Colgate Institute, especially Collaborative Humanities Grant and UTRA, which is Undergraduate Teaching and Research Award, with the additional support from Rockefeller Library and Brown's History Department. To bring everyone together here today and make this event possible, we're deeply indebted to the library's core support team, Jennifer Braga, Don Silva, Lizette Martinez for the organization, Michelle Venditelli and Marie Milcoti for their conservation expertise, and Ben Tyler for his artistic and digital expertise. We'll have 5 panels today covering all the units, which is the way that the objects are grouped in Depicting Glory. Panels are organized around different groups of objects, and scholars of different expertise will study the same group of objects from different perspectives. The panels will be moderated by Brown scholars. The final panel will be devoted to the digital challenges and solutions in creating this project. Now, to start off this series of discussions, let's welcome Professor Peter Perdue, Professor Emeritus of Yale University, to give us an overview of these objects. Professor Perdue.
Yes, first of all, many thanks to Zhuqing and to the library staff and Joe Meisel and Cynthia for organizing this conference, and as one of the first in-person conferences that I've done, and many of you have done in several years, it's really a great pleasure and definitely well appreciated to be able to put this all together. And thank you all for coming. So I thought I'd just make a few remarks about some of the materials in the Brown collection in a more general way in their relationship to the Qing project of producing and transmitting knowledge. So these materials, the maps, the battle paintings, and the text called Fang Lue, Military Campaign Histories, they all celebrate expansion and conquest. They're part of a larger project of the entire Qing bureaucracy to organize systematically knowledge for the current administration of the empire and to reconstruct the past. Like all empires, the Qing started small and ended big. Nurhaci's band of tribal warriors had become, by 1800, a huge expanse of territory comprising hundreds of millions of subjects. It extended from the Pacific Ocean to the heart of Central Asia. Military expansion was the primary goal of the Manchu elite from its origins to the end of the 18th century. But as the Chinese officials reminded them, ruling the empire on horseback was much more difficult than conquering the empire on horseback. So the Manchus could rely on their own banner administration to control the military side of the government and many of the frontier regions, but they had to govern the settled Han population with a regular civil administration, and that required a documentary archive to store precedents and to disseminate commands beyond the small group of military leaders who had founded the dynasty. Then this process really began when Nurhaci himself created or ordered to be created the written Manchu language in 1599. That was the first step towards taking a documentary archive. And we do have the Manchu documentary archive from the early days of the formation of the Manchu state. But after conquering Beijing and then the rest of the empire, it was the Chinese language and Chinese civil officials documentary production that really took the dominant role in administration of much of the empire. So along with this transition from military to civil administration, the Qing rulers developed a very large apparatus to collect information about the settled population under their charge. So for the Han population that was under Ming rule, they could adapt bureaucratic institutions that were inherited from the Ming. And they had the routine memorial system that was built on the Ming structure. And this expanded into a very huge information processing machine that was overseen by the Grand Secretariat, the top central state institution of the civil side of the Qing government. But then for conquests beyond the Ming boundaries, and as we said yesterday, the Qing expanded up to 3 times the size almost of the original Ming dynasty. This required a new type of administration and new kinds of documentary transitions and new kinds of officials. The emperor wanted a very personal connection to these officials in the frontier regions, and to coordinate all of these disparate structures, because he had different structures for the frontier regions, different reporting systems from the civil administration and from the other parts of the empire. That also required administrative innovations and new forms of information collection. And the one we know best is called the Palace Memorial System, coupled with the Grand Council. This was devised during the wars in Mongolia in the late 17th to early 18th century to manage quick decision-making by the emperor and his Grand Council that would be outside the routine memorial system. But then this Palace Memorial System expanded beyond its original function of military decision-making to encompass reporting of a whole lot of different kinds of social and economic information. And this included information on famines, grain prices, water conservancy, mining, and many other matters. So now, from these archives, both the routine memorial system and the Palace Memorial System, we have this large array of documents and a very much more rich understanding of the dynamism of the Qing policymaking in both the Han core and the frontier regions. But these weren't the only communication systems and documentary collections in the empire. There were others that haven't been studied quite so much. One of them is the Imperial Household Department. A new book has just come out on that. That was simply the apparatus that included materials as well as documents to provide for the needs of the emperor himself in the Forbidden City and his entire family and staff. That in itself was an enormous economic administrative entity. Local banner institutions also had their own ways of constructing knowledge and getting information about the places they ruled, and we have newer studies coming out about those too. So these sort of new administrative structures of the Qing developed because of this unprecedented expansion of the empire beyond the Han core. But the Qing also continued practices of the previous dynasties. It collected and published documents that were published in the Qing Shilu, the regular record of government activity, and that would be later included in a dynastic history. And then it added all of these new administrative and frontier collections on top of them. But in addition to all the textual collection and documentary archive making, it produced visual displays on top of this abundant textual documentation. And then in certain ways, and this is what I think we might want to talk about more, how we want to think about how much did the Qing transmit its view of events and its information through the bureaucracy to the wider public. As Dan Greenberg has argued that some of the Qing compilations were always just kept within the court and not intended to be made public. But I think others were made public in various ways, including maps, which either leaked out or were given out, and like the map we have in the Brown collection, were published commercially. So these objects in this Brown collection, like the maps and the battle paintings, are intended to display the accomplishments of the Qing military victories to broader publics, which might even include not just people within China, but visiting tributary envoys who came to the Ziguangge, the place where these paintings were exhibited. The two most important central interest institutions we know for policy in the frontier regions are the Lifan Yuan and the Fanglueguan. So these were both new Qing institutions to address specific issues of governance and control of the documentary archive. The Lifan Yuan was established in 1636. It supervised these new territories that were brought into the empire. It was originally called the Mongol Yamen, but then it extended to cover other territories, including Xinjiang, the Ambans, the top rulers in Tibet, and relations with Russia. The Fangreguan is somewhat less known. It was created in 1682 as part of the Grand Secretariat, the Nego, which is the older civil administration side of the government. And its task was to write histories of the military campaigns of the dynasty. We have quite a few studies of the Li Fangyuan, but not very much research on the Fangreguan. And I think maybe worth discussing this a little more in detail because, for example, the battle paintings in the Brown collection from the 19th century have texts added to it that pretty much comes from the Fangrue, the military campaign histories. And that's generally true for many of these visual productions which combine pictures and text and usually add details that come from the Fangreguan. The first one of these, Fangrue, was written in Chinese and recounted the suppression of the three feudatories from 1673 to 1681. There was a second one in Manchu that described victories over Mongol Khans in 1634 and 1676. Then there was the Xinjiang Pingding Shuomo Fangrue. This was the first bilingual campaign history commissioned by the Kangxi Emperor in 1696 to celebrate his victory over the Mongol Dzungar Khan Galdan. And then in the Qianlong reign, there were published two major collections, the Pingding Zhungar Fangrue in 1772 in both Manchu and Chinese, and the Huangqing Kaiguo Fangrue in 1786, which was a story, a portrayal of the original founding of the dynasty. So by the end of the 18th century, these Fangrue had pretty much covered the major military campaigns that had established the conquest by the Manchus and its expansion into the new territories. And this was a giant publishing operation, many of these published in 50 to 100 volumes. And it continued into the 19th centuries, as we see with the Fangrue that are really the textual basis for the battle paintings in the Brown collection. So who were the intended readers for this Fangrue and what message did it convey to them? Well, again, we don't have a whole lot of research about these Fangrue, and I myself have read some of them, two of them mostly all the way through, but certainly haven't surveyed all of them. So I won't say a whole lot, but two of these Fangrue were included in this voluminous compilation of classical sources, the Siku Transhu. And this was a giant compilation of material sources that the Qianlong Emperor had commissioned to display the dynasty's definitive sponsorship of classical learning. The two that were in this collection were the Kaiguo Fangrue, the one about the founding of the Manchu dynasty, and the Xinjiang Pingding Shuomo Fangrue, the one compiled under Kangxi in 1715, the one about Galdan. The Siku Transhu has been studied by a number of people. It purports to be a comprehensive survey of the entire vast array of Chinese and Manchu classical learning from ancient times up to the present, based on the best recent philological research with the best additions. And in many cases, it is actually the source of the most accurate texts and the most exacting examination of sources. But we also know that it's not an unbiased record. It was preceded by a literary inquisition. So the literary inquisition was a campaign to purge the classical record of works that were thought to have been insulting to the Manchus, or works that supported the resistance of loyalists of the Ming dynasty. And aside from these purged works, people have found that the highest achievements of Qing, so-called Kaozheng, or empirical philological scholarship, were involved in compiling the collection. And the historical achievements of the Orthodox Chinese dynasty certainly dominated, but the Manchus and Manchu writings had a place in this collection. The Manchu ambassador Tu Lishan had gone on a travel mission as an envoy to Central Asia and Russia, and wrote his travel account, originally in Manchu, later published in Chinese, in 1723. And this was one of the few texts that got into the Silku Chuanshu that really had completely Manchu origins. The Kaiguo Fanglue, however, one of these Fanglue, relied on archival documents from the early period of the Manchu state. And in that way, it portrays a particularly somewhat Manchu perspective on dynastic succession. But then people who have compared, now that we have the Manchu archive itself, the original Manchu documents, which were retrieved by the Japanese in Manchuria in the 20th century. We have that original Manchu archive. We can compare that to the Kaiguo Fanglue version of the founding of the Manchu state. We know that many inconvenient contingencies and nuances and other things were left out by this Fanglue. It smoothed out a good deal of the conflict and the uncertainty among the different Manchu tribes, for example. It was by no means for a foregone conclusion that it would be Nurhaci and his tribe that won out at the end of this conflict, creating the Manchu state. And it more or less tells the more plausible story for Chinese readers of Ming decadence leading to Qing backing from heaven and a victory endorsed by heaven. And we can say the same thing about the Shuomo Fanglue, the other one. It's really a partial view of Kangxi's campaigns, even though it has 48 volumes, Dren, and a huge quantity of archival documents in it. I have looked at it somewhat, and other people have. And if you look carefully, you find that sometimes the Manchu and Chinese versions are different in some crucial instances. And sometimes we can find other documentary accounts outside this Fanglue that don't really agree with the official version. There's, for example, two examples I found. One that Kangxi conducted several campaigns against the ruler Galdan, all of which are portrayed in this collection as great victories. One of them, we can be pretty sure, didn't really amount to anything at all. There wasn't a battle, and Kangxi at best did a kind of military tourism along the northwest border, visiting a few tribes, but never actually fighting really much of anything. But that is not what the Fanglue will tell you. And the second part, which I think I still am committed to, is the idea that's in here, in part of it, that Galdan, Kangxi's major Mongol enemy, committed suicide after he had suffered a major defeat. There's contradictory evidence between the Manchu and Chinese versions of exactly what happened. There's some other evidence from outside the Fanglue about what happened. So it's actually a murky subject. But the Qing and the Qing historians settled on this story of suicide, and they were sticking to it when they put this Fanglue together. I find, and some other scholars have found, that it's more plausible that Galdan had rivals who wanted to surrender to Kangxi, who poisoned him. And there was a doctor's report that looks pretty dubious as to Galdan's health. So it's a couple of examples of how this was certainly massaged history. And in that sense, we shouldn't really, but for convenience, we call them campaign histories or military annals. But they're also propaganda. They're also smoothing out the historical record. They're not just about military events either. They're not just a collection of documents. They are the products, in the end, of this vast information-generating apparatus of the Qing government. And the goal of all of this information apparatus is to stamp a view of history on subsequent studies of major campaigns. Then, as we know, the Qing produced visual materials to support these perspectives that were in the Fanglue, and the paintings depict the successful outcomes of the Qing army's key battles. The most famous paintings are the Qing battles in Xinjiang in the 18th century, which were then turned into etchings, which were distributed in Europe and are available in a number of libraries, including the Brown Library here, and displayed in this hall, the Ziguangge. This hall was originally built in the Ming and rebuilt in the Qing, and the Qianlong Emperor was the first to really use it for battle paintings. But he also used it to receive visiting tributary missions, as in the painting on the right of large banquet that's held in front of this hall. So he could transmit his image of this glorious, victorious empire to people who came to present tributary gifts. Matt Mosca will comment, I think, more on this later. He says the battle paintings, for example, were talismans against the anxiety of the age, which is a nice phrase, I think. The emperors really wanted to assure people, to assure their audience that they had won, that heaven had backed them, that this really was a heaven-sent victory. It really was a glorious victory. Yes, it was. I mean, it's de trop. I think they overstate the importance and the validity of this victory in so many ways that you have to think there's some anxiety underlying it, that people just might not believe it unless you keep on reiterating the message. There was a basis for critique of military expeditions in the classical Chinese tradition. You could be an emperor or a king accused of vainly wasting resources on useless military exhibitions, Chungbing Du Wu, damaging the welfare of the people. The benevolence of a ruler to the people required him to take account of their own welfare, their prosperity, and if you taxed them heavily and conscripted them into armies, you were damaging their welfare, which might be justified if this, in the end, led to victories, but could well be a useless waste. And critics were allowed to say this, and they said so when Kangxi started going out into Central Asia. There were critics in the lower Yangtze region who didn't understand why you should spend all these resources for these far off distant territories, or even to Taiwan, which was at that point called a lump of mud in the sea, an insignificant territory that didn't deserve any real attention from the Qing state. So you have to prove that these were justified in crushing textual form with these fangyue, supplemented by the paintings and the pavilion and the display and the ceremonies and everything else. When the Empress Dowager commissioned the new paintings for the Zhiguangge in the late Qing, she clearly had the same thing in mind. And it's interesting that these occurred in the 1880s, and this was a very interesting decade in the longer term history of the Qing. And we should not forget that, the late 19th century too often is simply subsumed, say, as a time of Qing decline. But that comes from our, perspective after the fact that the Qing fell in 1911. But that didn't mean that people at the time knew the Qing was declining, really. There were ups and downs in this whole period of the last half of the 19th century, and the 1880s was a relatively good time. The Qing had put down these armies of Yaqub Beg, a Central Asian military person who had occupied Xinjiang. They had put down the Muslim rebellion in Gansu. They had pushed the Russians who had moved into the Ili Valley. They had conducted in the end, astute diplomacy by raising loans from the British. The British were engaged in what's known as the Great Game of competition with the Russians in Central Asia. So through bankers in Shanghai, Zhuo Zongtang, the military leader, was able to raise loans from the British to support his army to put pressure on the Russians. At the same time, they sent astute diplomats to St. Petersburg to negotiate a treaty to get the Russians to withdraw. And it's one of the few diplomatic victories of this late Qing period. They did lose a war in the 1880s to the French, the Sino-Vietnamese War of 1884. And from our perspective now, we see that as pretty significant, since Vietnam had been a very loyal tributary state. Alongside Korea, Vietnam and Korea were the two most loyal tributary states to the Qing, and the Qing had vowed to defend Vietnam, and they had lost part of it to the French in 1884. At the time, however, it did not seem to be immediately damaging. And in fact, the man who was negotiated the treaty with the French was praised in Qing circles as having achieved a solution. They lost some of Vietnam, but not all of it, and they at least tried to fight back. At that time in the 1880s, I think in the Qing view, and even in the view of many foreign observers, the Qing was on something of an upswing. Nobody knew what would happen a decade later, of course, with the war with Japan. So you could have these paintings and you could have these fangria, again, celebrating these victories over internal enemies who were classified as rebels, and in typical fashion from these prints, which look a good deal like the prints of the 18th century. The defeated troops are this disorganized rabble who are unable to stand up to these very orderly, disciplined Qing formations. And we can hear more about that from other people. So this is just to indicate that we can look closely at what is included in these very impressive textual visual productions, but we should also be alert to what's left out of them. The battles didn't go really the way they're portrayed in the paintings. The fangria doesn't tell you the entire story of what happened. And then there's a larger framework of international connections to these, which are not really discussed in these kinds of materials. A question to discuss is when did the Qing view of this sort of relationship to the world start to change? This is a key issue of 19th century China. It always has been. The impact of the West on China. What is the real turning point when we enter what people want to call modern Chinese history? The canonical classical date, of course, still in mainland China certainly is the first Opium War of 1839 to 1842. But I think most of us who teach the Qing dynasty don't start the story at that date. We don't divide modern China into after 1842. We go back, as say my predecessor Jonathan Spence or John Fairbank did, at least to the beginning of the Qing dynasty. And in my case, when I taught at Yale, as Jonathan Spence did, start with the late Ming. If we want to talk about the long stretch of modern China when it's engaged with the early modern world in a significant extent, I think we have to start with the late 16th century. And so certainly the first Opium War is of some importance, but isn't necessarily the vital turning point when everything about the Qing view and the foreign view of China changed. It's a much more spread out process. But we can still talk, and we should, about just exactly when did things start to change. And part of the conventional view I think I would still support is that a man named Wei Yuan certainly represents a turning point. He was an official in Canton at the time of the First Opium War, and he wrote the comprehensive history of Qing military victories, the Shangwu Ji, in 1844. And this is a chapter by chapter, you might say, condensation of a good deal of the fangria material. It follows in a certain way the same process in chronological order, but has a preface to it that has a rather radical argument for the time, where he says, fighting war is superior to worshiping at ancestral temples. Zhang Shengyu Maotang. Now, in the old, I think, fangria and traditional way of presenting this, the fangria military matters and victories matter. They do matter for the health of the dynasty, but somehow they are subordinate to heaven's will. In the end, the point of telling all these stories about battles is that not the battles themselves, and not the idea that you might lose a battle and it depends on forces on the battlefield. The idea is to illustrate the victory as proving that heaven's will, that is, the heaven you worship at all these temples, was behind you. And Wei Yuan has just reversed the importance of these things. He says, no, winning the battle comes first. And then we can talk about heavenly justification. And although we won't challenge everything in this tradition openly, there is a good deal of evidence Wei Yuan was taking what we might now call a geopolitical view of the world. It's not a world where heaven, some outside force, transcendent force governs the world. It's a world of competing states, and China is only one of them. And China needs to know about the others, and there's no guarantee China will have heaven's backing in the future. Military campaigns are about national security in a world of competing states. He didn't put it that way exactly, but there's that implication that it's not really about virtuous suppression of barbarians. If you look at this 1814 map and those later Fangre, however, we don't, I think, see much of Wei Yuan's vision in those materials. So this carries on, they carry on this traditional view of the world, but certain voices are appearing and certain recognitions are appearing throughout the 19th century that we should track those more carefully to point the way to a different view of how the world works. And I'm running out of time, so I don't want to spend too much time on the second theme, but I think something I want to look into more, roughly the spatial consciousness of the Qing Empire. As the empire expanded, the whole consciousness of space and of geography and how to portray it changes over time. And we can look at material products like maps and other things to see how this awareness of geographical space develops. And so how did Qing officials and these map makers envisage these territories? How did they fit these territories into the wider world beyond the Qing borders? What did they think of the peoples that they ruled and the peoples who came to visit? Was there something we might call a spatial revolution in Qing imperial practice at some time? And how does this compare to other places at the time? Those are some of the questions in my mind I don't have answers to, but just a few suggestive ideas here. Charles Mayer, for example, has talked about the importance of territory in looking at modern history. Territory is a geographic space, as he said, set apart from others by laws and boundaries. And through the 19th century is a process for most countries in the world of defining these territories very specifically as national territories with maps, with barriers, customs borders, and defining them internally through railroads and communication systems. They pretty much took for granted that this is how you define a nation state through the 19th and much of the 20th century. But now, in the world of globalization, territory seems precarious with all the concerns about immigration, about capital flows, about insecurity of boundaries. How did this spatial sheltering emerge, flourish, and decay? Can we write a history of territory as a central attribute of human society? Could we write a history of territory for the Qing dynasty, for example? Another person who's talked a bit about this in another way is a Chinese historian Wang Hui, who said China experienced a spatial revolution in the 20th century. The imperial concepts of territory didn't disappear. It's not a simple shift from an empire to a nation state. The ideas of Tianxia, of all under heaven, of things that go beyond, or of Tim Brooks' great state, survive into the 20th century. And this is part of a global spatial revolution, which again, in Wang Hui's idea, is not really one of contending nation states and collapsing empires. It is multiple temporalities, the way he puts it, and horizontal displacements of concepts, actions, and institutions between empires. The old imperial ideals are still there. Certainly, we had a Third Reich effort in the 20th century and the other efforts at empires. And so it's not a simple story of the collapse of a Qing empire being replaced by a nation state driven passively by other forces. The Qing is an active participant in this late imperial world and creating new political constructions. The tributary system is another sort of way of visualizing this that's been invoked by many people. And the idea that China had a tributary system has been revived by a number of Chinese scholars and writers today, some of whom think that, first of all, that it is a system, which I don't think it was, and that it might even be an alternative to the so-called Westphalian system of international relations in Europe. The idea of a Westphalian state system in Europe, again, a misleading term, is that you have independent nation states which control everything within their own boundaries, but then engage in relations with other states of equal status across these boundaries. One thing we do notice about China, of course, and many people commented this, China is one of the only one of the great early modern empires that has pretty much retained the same territory when it has become a nation state, or perhaps two states, if we count Taiwan. Of course, the PRC is missing what the Qing had, Mongolia, Taiwan, and parts of Russia and Kazakhstan, but at least official orthodoxy, certainly Taiwan should be part of the future Chinese nation state. But the vast majority of the population and territory of the Qing Empire is under the PRC. And no other empire like the Ottomans or the British and the Mughals or Russians has achieved that. So this imperial ideal does, in that way, still survive in the China of today. Another interesting phenomenon is in recent Chinese writing, the revival of two curious, once considered marginal political theorists, geographical theorists, you might say, that the Chinese have now been translating and paying attention to. One is Halford Mackinder, who was a British geographer who had this idea about the great world island of Central Eurasia that had to be, if the power that dominated this great world island, the Eurasian continent, would dominate the world. His real concern when he wrote in the early 20th century was the rising power of Germany, that he thought British, with their maritime power, were not paying enough attention to it. They had to pay attention to the continent. And the German political theorist, Carl Schmitt, who was another curious figure who endorsed the Nazi regime, but had a legal theory of how balance of power works in continental Europe and across continental Asia, and espoused the idea of what's called the Großraum conception of geopolitics, a large state conception in which the world is divided into large regional blocks. He rejects or doesn't think that the system of nation states is really a legitimate one in legal terms. It really, Eurasia, Europe and Asia together should be under one regional power, something like Mackinder's idea in that way. And of course, for him, that power should be Germany. China, however, has certain ambitions, and finding Schmitt attractive in some ways, that it might be China that dominates this vast Eurasian space in the future world. So these are just some of the theories and ideas that are coming up these days that I think represent a carryover of some imperial ideals. I don't think I'll talk much about the 1814 map. You'll hear more about that later. But that map says it's done in the old style. That is, it doesn't really reflect these sort of newer ideas of conceptions of the world that Wei Yuan and others had. I think it carries on of much of the Fangrue tradition, even though it's privately published. It's based on some published official materials. It has an interesting caption on Russia, by the way, where it says that Russia is an ancient tributary state, and its border, do they mean the border or the capital of Russia is 12 to 13 days travel from the Jiaoguan, the gate in the Great Wall. But there's no border indicated on the map. And that's one of the features of these kinds of maps. There aren't, I believe, any borders for Vietnam or Burma or Siam, at least that I could find in the digitized copy. So this claims to be, all the countries of the world, Wanguo, this map, but it doesn't give you any useful empirical knowledge about what these other countries of the world are. So we could talk about what the purpose of this map really is. I guess I'll only end with a few quick pictures of some other kinds of maps and other ways of looking at the world that started to become influential in China, especially in the 1900s. Baron Richthofen was a German geographer and traveler who went around China, especially looking for coal resources in northwest China. And he produced these kinds of maps, which I think you can see are built around a very different conception of what space is. It's a mapping of underground space. So these colors here indicate places of major coal and mineral resources in Shanxi. This is Shanxi province here in the northwest, but the provincial border doesn't really matter, certainly, to Richthofen, in the sense the way the old Tianxia maps also don't feature the borders as much. What matters are where these resources are. And this is what caught the attention of Chinese when they were published. And a young mining engineer in Tokyo read these maps with great attention and wrote about them. His name was Lu Xun. You all know who Lu Xun later became, but he was actually a mining engineer in his young career in Tokyo, and wrote how China had to recover these coal resources that had been leased out to foreigners. And the Qing had some considerable success. The 1900s is another decade that's underestimated, I think, where the Qing made some successful efforts in recovering much of its coal resources. Another kind of map. This shows you changes in the new provinces established in the late Qing to establish more central control over these different regions, and the search for resources in Manchuria and Mongolia and Xinjiang is part of this central push. The new Qing provinces. This kind of map of Mongolian banners, and there's a recent dissertation on these, I know, though I haven't read it myself, are fascinating. There are hundreds of these done in the late 19th century surrounding each of the Mongolian banners, and very carefully indicating the topography and labeling them. And these, of course, are quite different, I think, from that larger Wanguo map. These are very bordered maps with specific information about places inside these Mongolian banners that the Qing wanted to pay a lot of attention to. This one is one of my favorites, again, from this decade of the last decade of the Qing. You have China and the other countries of the world represented by animals. And this was a very common thing that was in newspapers at the time. This map has its own story of being produced in Japan, I think originally, but going to Europe and then coming back into China in a Chinese version. And there you see various different animals, the Russian bear, of course, the American eagle, the French frog, the British lion, and then the Chinese figures of the sleeping mandarin, the banqueting guy, and the Mongolian horseman there. But notice that whole green area that is designated as China includes the frontier regions. If you look, it includes Mongolia here, called now in English Eastern Turkestan, and Tibet and Manchuria. So here you have China as this space surrounded by these hostile powers who are coming in on it, closing in on it, and China has to do something about that. But just to go ahead to the idea of the survival of Tianxia. Here we have, I think, the national map, the idea of the victim, China, the enclosed space that is being surrounded and attacked from all sides. But if you look at this one, this comes from Chiang Kai-shek's speeches in China's Destiny in 1943, which announced this very grandiose idea of what China really was as a civilization in the past. Of course, at this point, he was holed up in Chongqing and controlled very little of the border of the countries of China. But his idea, this is what appeared in the English translation of his speeches, has these interesting shaded areas that were lost to foreign powers from the Qing dynasty onward. And they include Outer Mongolia, which was independent, Tibet, which really wasn't under Qing Young's control, Formosa it's called, or Taiwan, under Japanese colonial control, and Korea. So why, I wonder, is Korea there in the shaded category, the same category? I have to wind up. That's the survival of the Tianxia idea. Finally, this is the map in the Brown collection that is quite intriguing. I'll just say you have this vast area of Shuguo, border territories under the Qing, which extends all the way out here to Afghanistan and Bukhara in Central Asia, and down here to Burma and Siam. So all of those old tributary countries are included in this map of somehow belonging to the High Qing, but also this yellow area, the so-called Han space of the empire, is distinguished from those outside areas. That's another, I think, European innovation. If you see the 1910 map, it has the yellow area, the old Ming borders, distinguished from the outside. And you have this one called China, which really is only about those borders itself. So in this map, I think we have this interesting combination of different ideas of space, that somehow the tributary states are part of this larger Qing Empire, but then there is this differently colored Han core. So that's enough. And thank you all for listening.